Good afternoon, everyone. Today's webinar is being recorded and will also be live streamed on YouTube. We'll share the link shortly. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with our colleagues. This webinar will run for 2 hours, and during this time, we request that the audience keep their cameras switched off and mics muted. We would have already done that for you. Attendees are requested to post questions in the Q&A and chat box. Since we do not have a dedicated Q&A session this time, speakers are encouraged to answer these questions through to the chat box or the Q&A box. On behalf of Terry, I extend a warm welcome to all our esteemed panelists and our attendees to our pre-conference webinar for the month of May 2021. Today's webinar delves into the challenges of adaptation metrics. Assessing global adaptation progress would ideally require frameworks and matrices that are applicable across countries and sectors and over time. Unlike mitigation, there is no simple, unique, and universal adaptation metric that can quantify adaptation results holistically. And so it's not surprising, given the complexity and the ambiguity of adaptation processes and the context-specific peculiarities and needs across regions and sectors and government levels. As a result, there is no consensus on what adaptation metrics should look like and how they should be used. IPAM's main objective is to facilitate the core design of metrics through exchange and innovation and take into account the need for aggregation and comparison. Towards that objective, IPAM has proposed a work program, AMME, Adaptation Metrics Mapping and Evaluation, to direct understanding of adaptation metrics in an arena where needs on the ground should drive policy recommendations, sectoral strategies, fundraising, allocation of fund, and scientific advancements. This webinar will present the principles on which the framework will be developed, among other key discussions. Various adaptation experts will discuss the framework concept before it is examined on a sectoral basis through our breakout sessions. To begin this session, I would like to invite Mr. Mohammad Aid Qadi for his keynote address. To you, sir. What happened?
Sir, you are muted.
About now?
Yes, I think now we hear you. Now we can't hear you, Professor Aid Qadi.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I want to share my presentation. Karim?
Yes, sir. You can now share your presentation. You have the rights.
Everything's ready.
Click on the share icon and share your screen.
Okay, you have that.
Yes, yes, it's coming.
Do you see it?
Yes.
Yes. If you can put it full screen, Professor.
It's full screen now.
Yes, excellent.
Well, colleagues and friends, dear participants, before sharing a few initial thoughts to open up our discussion, let me thank the organizers for their kind invitation. As you know, 5 years ago, COP22 was held in Marrakesh. This COP was built by Morocco as COP of action, translating progress achieved in Paris in concrete terms, and the COP for Africa, providing a unique opportunity to showcase actions for and in Africa, bearing in mind that vulnerability and adaptation in Africa are issues of high priority. COP22 was for agriculture a historical landmark, as the Marrakesh Proclamation explicitly refers to agriculture. The proclamation states, I quote, and you see it on the slide, "We heads of state, governments and delegations gathered in Marrakesh on African soil call for all parties to strengthen and support efforts to eradicate poverty, ensure food security, and to take stringent action to deal with climate change challenges in agriculture." End of quote. Hence, Marrakesh Proclamation has opened the door for more adaptation in the agriculture sector. By including food security and agriculture in Marrakesh Proclamation, the international community fully acknowledges that urgent attention is needed to preserve the well-being and future of those who are on the front line of climate change threats and impacts. This is a game changer for the 240 million African people still suffering from chronic hunger and the 80% of the continent's poor who live in rural areas and earn their income via agriculture sectors. This slide presents the agriculture challenges for Africa, and you can see for sub-Saharan Africa the importance of the combination of vulnerabilities and extreme events that the sub-region is experiencing. We were strongly convinced that COP22 in Marrakesh was the right moment to create a coherent delivery system to drive forward implementation of agricultural adaptation interventions in Africa. The Adaptation of African Agriculture Initiative, AAA, originates from this conviction. It's an ambitious initiative launched by Morocco to enable African agriculture to simultaneously improve productivity, reduce vulnerabilities, increase resilience, and manage natural resources more sustainably. It is closely aligned to realizing the ambitions agreed in COP22 in Paris and associated finance commitments. AAA engages with partners, African countries, providing support for capacity building, support for the development of national strategic plans for agriculture sector adaptation and transformation, and support for the development of specific projects at country level in the 4 solution streams of the initiatives, which are soils management, water management, risk management, and innovative agriculture finance for smallholders. We are adopting a process for efficient growth and scale up of AAA activities over time. This is supported by an evaluation and learning strategy to ensure the initiative can grow, evolve, and innovate based on thoughtful self-assessment and reflection on lessons learned. It includes a foundation-level metrics for success and the methodology and process for evaluation and learning over time. It is gratifying that AAA's unique value proposition and the advocacy of African agriculture adaptation has been recognized by the African Union. AAA reaches across more than 36 countries and maintains a network with considerable political connections and credibility. The initiative enjoys the support of a number of international and regional organizations, the private sectors, and NGOs. Its business model is to deliver through partnerships. The Ministerial Conference of AAA Foundation provides an opportunity to discuss the strategic priorities of African countries and the action programs and needs to be met in terms of the adaptation of African agriculture to climate change. AAA is supported by a high-level scientific advisory panel, which I have the honor of chairing. The panel is a representative group of scientists and experts at the international level who reflects on the activities of the initiative, ensuring their relevance, plausibility, and legitimacy, considering Africa's economic, social, technological, cultural, and environmental concerns. Friends and colleagues, dear participants, today, our world faces new challenges at unprecedented scale. Our meeting comes amid a global pandemic, amid an ecological crisis, and amid a climate crisis. Our fast-warming world is already experiencing major disruptions from more intense droughts, fires, heat waves, floods, destructive tropical cyclones, and extreme events. These supranational crises are interlinked. It is particularly concerning that the parts of the world projected to experience many of the compounding negative effects from global changes are also home of the world's poorest community. Elinor Ostrom, Nobel laureate 2009, said, I quote, "We have never had to deal with problems of the scale facing today's globally interconnected society. No one knows for sure what will work. So it is important to build a system that can rapidly adapt, rapidly." Yes, colleagues, challenges are everywhere. And as such, it would be easy to be very pessimistic as we scan the horizon. Nevertheless, there are glimmers of hope, and we should remain optimistic because we have the ability to confront and resolve the issues we collectively face. We are gratified by the fact that in this first semester of 2021, major summits were held and have generated political and societal momentum for action on climate. There is a rising evidence of a growing consensus that 2021-2030 is a decisive decade. Global emissions of greenhouse gases need to be cut by half in this decade. The Leader Summits on Climate Change, hosted by the United States, has offered a jolt of momentum for global action. New climate commitments under the Paris Agreement were pledged by most participating countries. Adaptation is now at the forefront of decision-making. At the Climate Adaptation Summit, hosted by the Netherlands, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated, I quote, "Support for adaptation and resilience is a moral, economic, and social imperative. Adaptation cannot be the neglected half of the climate equation. That is why I have called for 50% of the total of climate finance provided by all donors and multilateral development banks to be allocated to adaptation and resilience. In this sense, the World Bank committed to maintaining the share of its total climate finance that is earmarked for climate adaptation to at least 50%. In an important move, the IMF is increasing climate actions in its annual country economic assessments and will incorporate climate risks in its financial sector assessments. The IMF will also scale up capacity development to support member countries with climate-related skills and announce the launching of a new data initiative to help countries track climate risks and policies. Friends and colleagues, I consider that the present times are most favorable for far-reaching decisions to implement climate adaptation reforms. While the scale and complexity of this multidimensional challenge are huge, solutions are within reach. They can be realized through well-designed policies and smart investment supported by effective governance. In this context, governments should assert their leadership role in guiding solutions for building resilience and adapting to climate change, including stronger coalitions with the private sector and civil society. These coalitions often result in more innovative solutions, better suited to tackle the challenges, especially if supported by knowledge, timely information, and appropriate metrics, which is where IPAM makes an important contribution, as it will be presented to you by my distinguished co-panelists, with whom I am pleased to share the stage in this webinar. We feel very privileged as AAA Foundation to host IPAM's Secretariat. Colleagues and friends, let me conclude by saying that the economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic and concerns about climate change risks are coming together in a way that is creating unprecedented opportunities to build back better through fundamental economic, institutional, social, political, and technological changes. We have to grab this opportunity to fully link it with actions and to develop solutions for strengthening our country's response to climate change. Reducing emissions and building resilience is a 4 times win. Good for growth, good for jobs, good for health, and good for our planet. Finally, the adaptation challenge is mainly an opportunity to innovate, to invest, to become economically and societally savvy, smart and just, and to ascertain our sustainable future. I thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I now invite Mr. Karim Anige, coordinator of IPAM Secretariat, for his opening remarks and for an introduction to IPAM.
Okay, I start sharing my presentation. Is it okay? Does everybody see it? You hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, present myself. I'm Karim Angai. I'm a zoologist, ecologist, marine biologist, and by no means an adaptation specialist. I don't pretend to be. But I was called in 2016 as coordinator of the scientific committee for COP22. And COP22 praised itself to be an African COP. Being an African COP, of course, the focus was on adaptation rather than mitigation. And we acknowledged right away the statement of the adaptation gap report that there was a big gap in adaptation, even more at the time than now, especially in terms of finance. The president of the scientific committee, Mr. Nizar Baraka, was a former finance minister of Morocco, and to him, as such, the answer was easy. Finance was about mobilizing more than raising, and mobilizing funds needed possibilities to measure. Measuring means metrics. So he was pushing for adaptation metrics. But then, what is adaptation metrics? I put that question first that way, and then I corrected it in what are adaptation metrics, because there is no simple metrics as you know. But we try to respond to that question in through successive international conferences hosted in Morocco from 2016 to 2018, which corresponded to COP22 to 24. And these conferences, the two first ones were under the auspices of COP22. The second and the third were held at the UM6P University in Montreal. And all of them have been sponsored by GIZ, which are the three main sponsors for this. And well, you see on the down left a picture of presidents from COP22 and COP23, which were also stressing and raising this issue in Bonn. And last but not least, IPCC had a reach out event during the third international conference. Now, what are the outcomes of this conference series? I mean, the first outcome we had was a submission by the Kingdom of Morocco to UNFCCC, displaying the results of the first conference. In that first conference, we were looking at different ways to approach adaptation metrics. I mean, on impact on resilience, or through links to SDGs, or a sectoral approach. The sectoral approach was the one that looked the most promising, and Professor Wazar, who was the provost of the University Mohammed VI Polytechnics at the time of the two conferences held there, created an adaptation metric and techniques cluster focusing on water, agriculture, and resilient cities, which were the topics we focused on the last conferences, because especially for the first ones are the ones that are most cited in NDCs as is and that. And in 2019, before COP25, GIZ, to which I belonged at the time, organized an international workshop. As a question, what's next? We did these three conferences. Now we had a call for the creation of an international platform to follow up on that work. And so that's how IPAM was created by 5 founding partners. Mohammed VI Polytechnic University as an obvious partner, but let me stress out the 4 other partners because each of them is also chairing a sectoral committee because for simple reason that each of these members have their specialty, and they just fit with what was started with in the past conferences. I mean, AAA initiative, who assumes the role of the secretariat and also financing for now. I mean, a full job employment, and for that, and the website and other things, is taking the lead on agriculture, obviously, and it has already been joined by 11 other associate members. The Back Center for Climate Change has a previous experience on cities and is focusing on that topic under the leadership of Marta Olazabal, with the 17 other associate members at the moment. Professor Waza is leading on behalf of the African Scientific Research and Innovation Council, the Water Committee, with 11 associate members for now. And our chair, Carl Schulz from the Higher Ground Foundation, is focusing on techniques and tools. And the 14 associate members already joined his committee. I just want to insist that the number of associate members is open. I mean, you just go to our website and you can register, and you're welcome to help. Not only the number of associate members is open to increase, but also the number of committees. If some people want to come up with other specific dedicated committees, they are welcome. Now, what are IPAM's objectives? IPAM's objectives are of three kinds. First one, to connect expert practitioners and decision makers to the organization of events. That's what we already did since the beginning in 2016 through dedicated conferences. And we have a community of practice of more than 120 experts that participated in these conferences. Then promote capacity building, research exchange, data enhancement, and develop approaches, instruments, and tools to facilitate the effective finance and policy making for climate adaptation. This is what is being done in the committees, actually. And the day-to-day work, and this is a call to expand. But finally, facilitate the co-design of metrics. I mean, co-design is very important. IPAM is open to every goodwill, and we want to propose a framework on adaptation monitoring, adaptation metrics monitoring and evaluation, which will be soon done now. And I hope this will provide for one proposal of definition. What is adaptation metrics? Thank you.
Thank you, Karim. For our next intervention, I invite Mr. Carl Schulz, who is IPAM Chair and also the founder of the Higher Ground Foundation, and Mr. Paul Forte, member of the Higher Ground Foundation. They will take us through the framework of AMME, Adaptation Metrics Mapping and Evaluation.
Thank you, Swati, and thank everyone from Terry and the World Adaptation Science Program for inviting IPAM to participate and to organize this webinar. Today, we're going to talk further about what we call AME, which is the Adaptation Metrics Mapping and Evaluation work program. And we're going to talk about the framework we have for it. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Paul for his introduction to the agenda.
Just be unmuted there. It's nice to be here. Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. And I'm going to take you through just the agenda of what we're going to cover in the next 25 minutes or so before the panel session. There we go. So our agenda today in our session, there's challenges and opportunities, as we've heard in the keynote session already, in adaptation metrics. We're going to explain a bit more what we mean by AME, Adaptation Metrics Mapping and Evaluation, and why we believe it is needed. We're also going to pick up on our vision for this framework and our ideas for it. We'll have a panel discussion which will build on our actual presentation and address some of the questions in more detail. And then we've decided, and I hope Swati and colleagues will forgive us for this, but we decided we'd like to have a breakout session involving yourselves as well. So technically a new departure, and I think it'll be quite an interesting one as well, where we're going to ask you to address some of those questions as well and feedback. And then we'll tell you some of the next steps as well after that. Carl, go ahead, you're next.
All right. So Karim has already discussed a lot of the broader context, but I just want to try to put this into a little bit of policy and sort of a historical framework here. If you could click. So even since the African COP that Karim mentioned, there's a growing recognition, a realization that we really need to develop or identify adaptation metrics that are fit for purposes. Karim mentioned that there's a considerable gap between the needs and the investment going into adaptation. There's a challenge regarding how one implements and knows if they're implementing appropriate adaptations that reduce vulnerability and enhance adaptive capacity. There are challenges of target setting at all levels, but certainly at the international and national level. And there's also a burgeoning interest in investment that meets environmental, social, and governance objectives that is sprouting in lots of interest in, well, how can the SDGs, how can climate, and how can all of these needs for environmental, social, and governance priorities be measured? Now, for adaptation, the Paris Agreement and its global stocktake, including its global goal on adaptation, is something that's being reviewed. And there's been identified by the Adaptation Committee and many others priority concern over how do we really take stock and measure and set objectives and goals. And adaptation metrics is critical, I think, for that objective. Additionally, the SDGs, the Sendai Framework, and other international treaties need to integrate adaptation and need to understand how targets can be set for adaptation. And as relates to ES&G, there's been a growing interest in the investment sector, including developing guidelines under the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD, that calls out for a more appropriate adaptation metrics. IPAM aims to be congruent with all of those initiatives and to help support those so that we can achieve better target setting and achieve the adaptation goals of all of these different initiatives. Next slide. So just to speak briefly, we all, I believe, understand that the impacts are significant already and growing in terms of rising sea levels, ecosystems, economic activities like in particular agriculture, as was noted by our keynote speaker. So the impacts are growing, but let's think about what can you do? And what we can do besides continuing to focus on mitigating emissions, which is something we cannot ignore. But there has to be a realization that we need to adapt. And by adapt, we mean adjusting to the actual or expected climate and its effects. Next slide. So there's a commonly pronounced statement that I think is useful, and that is that what gets measured gets done. But do we get done what we need to be doing if we have the appropriate or inappropriate metrics is the question. Now, metrics for adaptation can assess vulnerability, risk, resilience, or climate impacts. And they can track really implementation of adaptive responses, and they can help to monitor and measure adaptation results. But central to effectiveness and efficiency of adaptations and investment are identifying the appropriate metrics that match up with users' needs. We need these at all levels, at all scales, for programs, for projects, for national and for activity level adaptation. And we need to be able to compare them so that we can learn from them and do better. Next slide. So IPAM, as Karim already mentioned, aims to really be the reference platform for adaptation metrics and to further develop tools and techniques and respond to not just today's perceived adaptation needs, but to identify and work with emerging adaptation needs as they grow and to grow with also the tools and techniques that exist. So we have a program of activities that have already been mentioned, so I'm not going to dwell on them, but that includes connecting experts. It includes what we're going to be speaking about imminently, which is a collaborative work program, and then also setting agendas and convening people to discuss metrics. So next slide. So we're going to be focusing on that third set of activities, and that has to do with what we call Adaptation Metrics Mapping and Evaluation Work Program. It's something that is still under development. In fact, today we really are seeking a better understanding from all of you participants and panelists so that we can get your feedback on how appropriate the work program framework is and the principles are to address adaptation metrics. And so we've a number of things that we want to look at, and that's including user need, taxonomies and definitions so that we have clarity of what we're talking about. We need to be thinking about, are we considering this in an appropriate systems perspective? Are we looking at this both from a sectoral perspective, as a lot of the work has been done so far, but also considering the multidisciplinary and transversal issues that span cross sectors and consider those systems? Timeframes are critical, as is the scale of interventions, and not all metrics can naturally match up between different timeframes and different scales. And so the framework that we're working to develop aims to really help design and fund metrics for the mapping and evaluating of metrics, so that we can also provide guidance for the implementing of these mapping and evaluation projects that we intend to undertake within the committees and elsewhere within IPAM. So I'm going to turn this over to Paul to talk more about the key principles of the AMI framework so we can dig into the meat and try to get some feedback from you after this. So Paul, over to you. Sound, please.
You're muted still, Paul.
Sorry, everybody. It did it automatically without telling me. You can hear me now. Okay, so Carl's outlined what the AMI framework is looking to address, and we've listed just a few key, some principles just there, but we're going to focus on 4 in particular. They're not the only 4, but we think they are very interesting 4 to be looking at and to focus on here today. And they are the user need focus. So very clearly, who are the metrics for? What is the purpose? The taxonomies and definitions, which Carl also referred to there. We need to know what are we talking about and how might we classify and group things. The systems perspectives is one which is dear to my heart, with my background being in the healthcare sector in particular. I see all too often the problems that occur when different parts of the same system go their own ways and don't consider what the cross links might be or how they affect each other. And I think that's a very important thing that needs to be drawn out, particularly in the climate change adaptation field. And ultimately, the purpose of metrics, apart from serving the users and looking at systems perspectives, etc., ultimately they're being used for decision making in some form or another. That could be at an international level, it could be national, regional, down to a local particular district or particular interest groups. Somebody will be wanting, or groups will be wanting, to make decisions, and they'll want information on which to make these best decisions. And this is what metrics really fundamentally supports. As a nice little just graphic here, thank you very much for this, Marta, who helped us put this together. Basically, you may have seen these sorts of ideas about defining and considering options, planning, implementing, evaluating and learning. That's not a new concept, but it applies to the climate change adaptation field as much as anywhere else. And key to all of making this circle work and continue are metrics. Now, we sometimes jump straight in at metrics being something to evaluate and look at all the time and monitor how we're doing, and that is an important aspect. But actually, we'll be wanting to use these data items and the metrics looking prospectively as well. How do they help us shape decisions? How do they help us plan? As well as how do they help us check where we're at and the quality of what we've undertaken? So those are key principles that we really think are particularly important. And we're going to try and illustrate these a little bit through our little graphic here, which may or may not be two countries or two regions completely drawn up to sort of examine and explore some of these ideas. So we call them Upper Wash, which is has all the upstream support from the water sources from the mountains, etc. A wealthy agricultural service economy with a city and various settlements, but their own problems: environmental pollution, increasing droughts, flooding. We have Lower Wash, which has issues to do with coastal inundation, issues of desertification. They had former economic productivity with agriculture and fishing, but that seems to have a problem. There are public health concerns. These are all sorts of issues which any sort of country you might want to look at may have combinations of these, more of one than the other, etc. But you can see immediately that we're looking at places as a whole system and trying to look at them in the round. It's not just water, it's not just farming, it's not just cities, they all connect. So Carl, you're going to take the next one on the user need focus.
Thanks, Paul. So we're going to try to unpack a little bit of what we're hoping to convey and how these principles are relevant for adaptation metrics mapping and evaluation. And so we're going to do these in turn and try to really see how this example can help to elicit understanding. So the first of the principles that we would like to use is user need focus. And the purpose of metrics really lies in their use. It lies in the capacities of the users, their access to the metrics, the data, the skill, the time that they have, and the costs. It's also a question of, well, what do they really require to meet their objectives? And then thirdly, it's a question also of being able to communicate metrics between different users. And this we can say could potentially be a challenge. So let's lay out some potential users in Upper and Lower Wash. To start with, let's talk about a water resource manager based in Upper Wash. So this water resource manager is interested in a few metrics that are related to, and Paul, if you could, they're interested in trying to secure sufficient good quality water resources. And so seasonal rainfall and snowfall from the mountains above their highland farms and above and upstream from their capital city, which is River City, is important. Also, of course, groundwater levels are relevant, and so is water demand, both for the farms and for the urban dwellers and the industry. Now, for the farmers who are up in the highlands, they're concerned about crop productivity. And so for them, it's the rainfall levels and the timing, it's the water supplies and the pricing of water, and also to the extent they need it, it's irrigation requirements, in terms of volume primarily, and where they can get it. Okay, now let's move down to River City and this water resource department. Their interest is water supply and quality. Unlike so much the agriculture, quality becomes important. Also, treatment costs and the metrics around that, and along also, of course, water demand and by sector, residential, commercial, industrial, etc. These are a little bit different needs than the water resource manager for lower wash, who's downstream and is facing questions over, well, what's happening upstream for their water supply? Precipitation's important. They don't have snowpack to rely on except from the Wash River. Groundwater is important. Quality, of course, is important for their consumers of water and demand. You know, there's other parts to water than just water supply and water consumption. There's what you do with the wastewater. And we can also say what you do when too much water is provided to a particular area. And so for the Public Works Department, the issues are upstream rainfall and water levels. When there's a flood, the depth and duration of that, the surface and soils, the river levels, the effluent qualities and quantities that require some sort of treatment, and also drainage capacities of their sewage system. Now, this is different, of course, than the Coastal Management Authority's views on water. They need to look at storm data, sea level rise, salinity, river flow, and quality. And then for the fishers and those who help support the fisheries management, water temperature, nutrients of the ocean, and weather events become critical. All of these people are interested in water metrics, but all of these metrics are different. So we need to be thinking within IPAM and within AMI about how you deal with these different user needs. So let's talk about the second principle here.
Quickly.
Absolutely. Clarity is critical, and brevity. So when it comes to taxonomies, what we're talking about here is how you set boundaries, how you really look to what you should be counting, what should be paid for, what should be rewarded. All of these things are important. Also, how do we avoid misunderstandings in planning and management between different parties who are involved in this? Without clarity in terms of the categories and the definitions, this can lead to real problems. Also, there's a need, as noted, user needs around harmonization and aligning the different metrics and their applications, even within a sector, even just talking water, for instance. So real briefly, let's come up with a little case study here. And this is how water adaptation in the upper and lower wash is interpreted by people who are trying to support, through grants, community level water adaptation. Now, in upper wash, these grants are awarded for water adaptation, but they only really need to be considering any increase in water supply to count and secure grant money. Lower wash, they have a different interpretation. And this is, they are considering water adaptation to have to look at forward-looking climate change projections, how things are going to change there. What's the water, but they also include everything from water supply to wastewater and also to flood control and coastal erosion. And so obviously you have a situation here where the metrics that are needed are going to be very different if you don't have clarity over what they are. When, for instance, Upper Wash submits its nationally determined contribution and talks about what it's doing in water adaptation, it may actually show itself to have a very different set of numbers and amount that's contributed compared to what Lower Wash is doing. And so when you look at these NDCs, because there may not be clarity over what they're talking about water adaptation, the metrics could confound an understanding over what progress has been done towards the global goal on adaptation. So over to you, Paul, to talk about the third of our principles.
Thank you. And just in case the panel members are getting worried that there's not been time for the panel discussion, there's just 2 more slides I'm going to run through very quickly before we then hit the panel discussion itself. Of the 4 things we said we'd look at, I'm just going to cover now quickly on systems perspectives. And this is the idea that we've got a lot of things going on here. We've talked about water supply, and we can measure this in different sorts of ways, flooding, reservoir levels, etc. There's the issues around land irrigation, salination. We could be looking at how that affects productivity yields, soil salinity. You can sort of measure that. It's microsiemens per centimetre. I find something there. We can also be looking slightly more generally at things like new agricultural practices, etc. Population health could have a feeling in this. We could be looking at waterborne disease incidents. We could also be looking at levels of pollution in water supplies. With the population, there could be longer term demographic changes, migration changes, gender equality issues as well could come to the fore as economics and things change. And of course, there's wider, longer scale economic and political impacts, such as which might affect, for example, migration from agricultural to the urban economy, affecting levels in education, investments in water infrastructure, and issues that spill over into national and potentially international issues to be addressed about water resources. And metrics need to take account in a systems perspective of things like timescale. So some things might be very immediate, some things may have a very long lead time before construction, adaptation, cultural changes or whatever materialize. So an issue there is for any projects and evaluation is how do you actually maintain that length of time of input of observing and collecting information and data. Then there's changing definitions. All you have to do is start changing the definitions of boundaries of cities and population changes, and there are discontinuities then over longer periods of time which can emerge. And again, that's something that has to be accounted for and watched out for. The whole issue about appropriate timely communication, this feeds back into the issue about the decision-making process. If information and data aren't being shared or brought to the attention of when decisions have to be made, then they might completely miss the opportunity for funding decisions, decisions to give go-ahead on different projects, etc. It has to consider and be fitting in with whatever the particular cycles are in communication. And similarly, we have to take account of the purposes that decisions are being made for and the timescales of those actual decision processes. And my final slide before we move on to the panel here is the 4th key principle we're looking at is it's all about information for decision making. On this picture, you can see we can be measuring things sort of real time in this particular flood instance. Other areas are people gathering together as stakeholder groups and having different processes to gather information, gather people's opinions, values, beliefs, etc., and bring those to the picture. We might be looking at telemetry, remote sensing these days. We could also be looking at modeling, at information, which is not just to say what's happening at the moment, but how can we use that information to project ahead, simulate storms, simulate different sorts of things we want to look at. So very quickly, we've got metrics design. We have simple indices, but are they fit for purpose? What are our technologies for collecting the data? How do we start building more complex indicators? In healthcare, we talk about quality adjusted life years, for example, where you're bringing 2 or 3 metrics together to combine to a single one. We want to look also at methodologies for evaluating. It's one thing to have the data, it's another thing as to what you do with it. And there's a variety of different sorts of techniques, for example, balanced scorecard, MCDA, etc. We want to look ahead, doing some modeling. And finally, we need to be considering how this all fits with processes for evaluation. So there we have it. It's fraught with problems, but it's no excuse for saying it's not too difficult. I'm now going to head over for the panel discussion and over to you, Swati, to introduce our distinguished panel.
Thank you, Paul and Carl, for a very comprehensive introduction to the framework. We will now quickly move on to our panel discussion. We have an esteemed set of panelists for today who are all experts in their respective fields. This panel will be moderated by Dr. Anand Patwardhan, who is a professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. He's also the co-chair of WAR's Science Committee and the chair of Adaptation Futures Science Committee. Our experts for today are Mr. Jean-Pierre Mbasi, the Secretary General of United Cities and Local Governments of Africa, Ms. Andrea Nowak, who is an environmental policy specialist from CGIAR, Dr. Aditya Bahadur, principal researcher of the Human Settlements Group at IIED, and he's also a part of the co-development group at the Adaptation Research Alliance, Ms. Snigdha Garg, who is a senior manager of the Adaptation Research and Integration Group at the C40 cities. Dr. Patwardhan, I hand it over to you for the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Swati, and great to be here. Again, this is a part of the Adaptation Futures and WASP webinar series. Really great we are having this discussion on metrics. And thanks very much to Paul and Carl for providing this rich overview of the AMME program. You know, I think as Paul and Carl mentioned, metrics are important. They are in fact quite critical in a way to stimulate action. We need to measure them. We need to measure for a variety of purposes. And we often talk about indicators or metrics being smart, that they permit us, that they're measurable, that that they are attainable, and so on. So I guess one of the starting points then for us for this panel would be to really hear from the panelists who actually come from a very wide range of sectors and expertise backgrounds about from what you've heard from the presentation, what do you see as some of the key uses and users of the metrics? For what purposes? I think purpose was one of the key ideas that Carl and Paul talked about. And in the presentation, are there some use cases perhaps that are missing from the presentation you just heard? So what I'd like to do is to start with this first question to pose to each of the panelists. So perhaps starting with Jean-Pierre, and then Andrea, and then Aditya and Snigdha. So Jean-Pierre, over to you. If you could respond in 2 or 3 minutes, so we have time to go through and have a rich discussion. Thank you.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, this is fine.
Okay. For those who don't know me or our organization, I'm speaking as the Secretary General of the United States and Local Government of Africa, the umbrella organization of subnational and local government across the continent of Africa. We are based in Rabat, Morocco, and we cover all the African regions. Well, for us, adaptation to climate change is mainly a context-specific and local issue. So it depends on geographical situation, ecosystem condition, knowledge of the history of the local context, social capital, and available financial resources of local public and private actors. Because of this very local and context-specific nature, adaptation action need common understanding on the way to measure impact of climate change on the various areas of local life. So the first challenge is to agree on the scope and diversity of impacts to be considered. Adaptation need can be very diverse considering the nature of climate change impact, the territory to take into account, and the kind of damages and repairs associated with the impact of climate change events. But despite the importance of this issue, there's no international recognized method for evaluating adaptation project. Reason for that the very nature of adaptation is not constant. It varies on spatial and temporal scales. The perception of vulnerability is not the same. And we see that the problem of metrics of adaptation projects are not yet being satisfactorily addressed. And we remember that the Committee of African Head of State and Government on Climate Change, CAHOS, addressed this issue during its session of 9 February 2019 and encouraged partners working on the climate ecosystem in Africa to strengthen the transparent framework for measurement, reporting, and verifying progress made in both mitigation and adaptation climate action. And in this declaration, our organization, UCIG Africa, was cited among the partners to mobilize in this effort. And this is fully justified because subnational and local government are the public authorities closest to the citizen and are therefore well placed to ensure their involvement in the collective effort to adopt adaptation action to climate change and strengthen the resilience of cities and their inhabitants. What I want to say also is that Africa, UCIG Africa brings into the equation its own experience in the implementation since 2015 of the Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy in Sub-Saharan Africa, COMSSA, that we implement in collaboration with the Council of European Municipalities and Regions, CMR, and ICLEI Africa, with the support of the European Commission. Through COMSSA, UCIG Africa and its partners provide direct support to over 250 cities in 36 African countries for the definition of local climate energy plans. And through this action, we have been exposed to a series of situations where adaptation action were solicited. Hello? We also bring our experience working with OECD in the issue of the inclusion of subnational and local government in water governance in Africa. Through this partnership, UCIG Africa is developing an observatory on territorializing water policies and strategy. These experiences have also brought forward the need for adaptation metrics. This is the reason why UCIG Africa fully support the Adaptation Metrics Mapping and Evaluation program. But measurement and comparison of impact of climate change events require that we agree on the way in which these impacts are described and scaled in order to be in the capacity to formulate rescue and overurgent measures to face the disaster situation, and at the same time, take anticipative measures to prevent the occurrence of such situations in the future. And the proposal to co-design the adaptation matrix is appropriate. But who to bring to the table for this co-design? The recommendation of UCIG Africa is to take as point of departure concrete situation where measurement is needed to describe the situation, evaluate the consequences of the impact of climate change events, and simulate the effect of preventive measures as well as norms to be adopted to avoid the repetition of ill impact of climate change events. AME should therefore adopt a learning by doing approach on the basis of pilot case studies where this co-design of common understanding of how to harvest data, how to build indicators, should reflect the diversity of situation, accepting excess of an error with the aim to progressively build a robust adaptation MRV framework. So the first stakeholder to bring to the table are, of course, local community, subnational and local government, and the actor of the local economy. We think also the second category to bring to the table is the policymakers at the level of the national state and the intergovernmental organization. These people need to benchmark and compare performances of policies and strategy pertaining to adaptation action. The third category is the research community and the insurance companies. These people need to work hand in hand to agree on the data harvesting routines and quality indicators addressing the issue of predictability, modeling, and evaluation of policies and strategies. I think this is what we want to bring into this conversation.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. Thank you for that comprehensive view. And I think thank you also for reminding us of the contextual and local nature of action, and that very often we have different purposes, including characterization of vulnerability and impacts, but then also switching over to understanding how responses are taking place at these different scales and indeed feed into a higher level action. Let me turn now to Andrea Novak from CGIAR, bringing in a very different perspective from the agriculture sector. And perhaps if you could focus on really where you see some of the gaps in the presentation that we have just heard in terms of laying out what some of the key application areas or users or uses for metrics might be. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Anand, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to these discussions. I think the watershed example that Paul and Carl brought about during this conversation is really nice and also illustrative, an illustrative metaphor for all the plethora of frameworks available to monitor and evaluate adaptation at different scales in different geographies and sectors, and shows just how many uses and users of adaptation frameworks and metrics are out there. And once you step into this adaptation metric space, you realize it's a very messy space, and it's messy because it's very cluttered, and because you have multiple tools and metrics that maybe serve many different purposes, but some that serve the same exact purpose. And you also have gaps. You have like needs that are not addressed by the tools we have, like adequate tools and metrics that help you understand the consequences of the results of your actions, the positive and negative impacts of your adaptation actions. And really taking a pragmatic stand on the issue, and based on our experience with reviewing climate adaptation indicators and metrics in the agriculture sector and in the context of climate change, we believe that we need to invest more in sharing experiences and improving what we have, take stock of what's there in the space, and focus our attention on really designing tools and metrics that can fill existing gaps, that match emerging needs, such as evaluating the positive and negative effects of adaptation actions, looking at transformational outcomes, cost-effective methods to measure value-added benefits of adaptation, to be able to then say that what you've been doing is indeed climate change adaptation and is not business as usual development. And we think that the really powerful thing about IPAM's initiative, AMY, is that it opens up an opportunity to bring some order in this crowded universe. And as Jean-Pierre mentioned, for adaptation practitioners, for planners, different levels and decision makers, and even researchers, there is a lot of value of a comprehensive mapping of what's out there in terms of metrics, in terms of data collection and evaluation tools, an understanding of what monitoring and evaluation questions can be answered by using available metrics and tools, and what are cost-effective ways to evaluate those longer-term outcomes. So the use case that I'm highlighting now is really about trying to work in the space that it exists and make improvements and fill those gaps that are being identified by this mapping, and to really ensure usership and value proposition of this initiative. It is really critical to have those users at the table, as Jean-Pierre also mentioned, to open up the space for them to share these experiences and their knowledge, but also to contribute to this like co-organization of the adaptation metrics universe. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrea. And I think the two key takeaways that I wanted to highlight, one is I think very much appreciate the importance that you raised of evaluation. I mean, indeed, one of the things we want to do with metrics is support decision making, whether it's decision making regarding the choice of adaptation interventions, which might include things like looking at costs and benefits, amongst other things, but then also looking at impact evaluation, which is did what we do work, and was it the right thing to do? So I think that aspect is an important one, as is I think your emphasis on the process, which is that, and both you and Jean-Pierre mentioned that regardless of what the metrics eventually are, the process of identifying and developing them should involve users from the outset, and that's I think an important aspect that needs to be brought in. But maybe this is a good moment to hear from Aditya, who has had a lot of experience with doing some of this, including knowledge management in the various roles he has had at IIED and before. So Aditya, over to you.
Anand, and thank you to IPAM for inviting me to speak today. I'd like to firstly, of course, congratulate the platform on this initiative and the really interesting presentation that we just heard. I think when it comes to use cases, Anand, to answer your question directly, I think 4 broad things jump out to me. The first, of course, is research. Improving quality of metrics will definitely lead to improving quality of research. And of course, I understand it's a synergistic relationship. Let's think about whether the IPCC process by tracking potentially a uniform set of metrics on adaptation longitudinally, the massive impact that it can have on the state of knowledge on what works and why. The second vertical I think that is important to discuss is policy, and I think Carl talked about this in the opening of his presentation. But I'd just like to go further and remind everyone that all the major development policies that are currently out there have a big emphasis on resilience and adaptation. And I'm talking about the SDGs, the Sendai Framework for Action, the outcome statement from the World Humanitarian Summit, the Paris Climate Agreement, the World Urban Forum. Through all these agreements and treaties, countries have signed up to taking action on adaptation and resilience. And unless we have good quality metrics, these aspects of these policies will fall flat. So it is crucial to the global development policy architecture that we have sharp and useful metrics on adaptation. The third vertical is on practice. And as we all know, there is a burgeoning set of adaptation programs in different sectors across the world. I think some of us have been there from the beginning of the journey a couple of decades ago, where the discourse was just starting. And now we are in a very crowded constellation of programs. But to ensure that finance is being invested in the most effective examples of practice, we need to have valuable metrics. So again, that's another very valuable and important rationale for this intervention. The fourth thing that underlies these 3 pillars is financing. And I think Carl touched upon that again, Carl and Paul both in their presentation. But again, I'd like to talk about this from a slightly different perspective, where metrics become crucial for advocacy linked to financing. The global community of practice urging and working on climate action is converging on ensuring that the $100 billion that have been promised by developed countries to developing nations as part of the Paris Agreement actually start flowing into the coffers of these countries. And of course, part of this $100 billion has to be used for adaptation. And if we can demonstrate that we are really getting value from investing in adaptation through the use of metrics that are fit for purpose, will provide a massive boost to that argument, and then ultimately to the flows of financing. Anand, I'll stop there and hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aditya. That was extremely helpful, and I think you have indeed laid out kind of the 4 key domains or settings in a way: research, policy, practice, and finance. And I think as the AME program develops within each of these contexts, there might indeed be a range of different application areas. So in finance, for example, we might want to think not just about the generation, but also questions of delivery and where the money is actually going and who is receiving it. So I think you have really captured the 4 broad domains very well. With that, let me turn over to Snigdha for your thoughts. Snigdha, over to you.
Thanks, Anand. So from cities' perspective, which is where I come from, I think what Jean-Pierre also said, it's very context specific, and that local context becomes so crucial here. But I think it's really also important to just pause and think about what do we want to monitor and why. And that's where the users change, and that's where your use cases also vary. So you could be monitoring your outputs, you could be monitoring your outcomes or your impacts. And for each, there are different use cases and users as well. And all of them very valid, but also vary significantly. So some of the key use cases from cities that I can think of, I mean, obviously the obvious ones that you already mentioned is impact evaluation, right? Which is super key, very important to make the case for adaptation actions. And as Aditya was pointing out, therefore to increase investment in adaptation further on, right? Then also to improve decision making and showcase the benefits. But also, I think one of the things that it helps, especially because adaptation is so cross-cutting, it helps in enhancing transparency and just bringing in that accountability in the process, which we tend to not see that much of because we don't have those metrics. So it's a catch-22 here. But then also then facilitating learning across cities. So just that sharing of knowledge becomes much easier if you have those metrics. And then, of course, encouraging participation and engagement from cross sectors, not just the sustainability team of cities, but across different sectors, which Carl was pointing out to. And I think a couple of things from there to think about and definitely include in the metrics are: one, impact on whom, what are we measuring, to just ensure the actions that we are delivering are reaching the ones it's most necessary for, which brings back the point of vulnerable communities and communities in general, of course. And then, of course, to ensure that all the indicators that we're talking about or the use cases that we're talking about are actually mainstreaming adaptation actions rather than looking at them in silos. I think the biggest mistake we can make is if we consider adaptation in silos. I feel it's an opportunity to stop doing that and move more cross-sectoral.
Thanks very much, Snigdha. I think really good points, and I particularly appreciate your point about thinking cross-sectorally, which I think fits quite well into the systems perspective. That was one of the principles that that Paul and Carl were advocating. I guess we are running short on time, but one of the questions that the presentation raised for me was, how does this framework that is being developed by IPAM help us navigate a couple of tricky balances that we have to strike when it comes to adaptation metrics? And I would say one of those critical balances is between the need to be, sort of not falling into the trap of measuring things that can be measured simply because indicators are available, but rather making sure that we are actually focusing on what does need to be measured. But then the other balance, which also came up in the points earlier, which is between the need to have the contextual richness and versus a need to have a degree of comparability and aggregation. So I think, again, in terms of the design, metrics design, that these are balances that need to be struck. And I really want to just open it to anyone in the panel who might want to respond, because we are running low on time. So I think I just want to pose this and see if anyone from the panel would like to quickly respond, and then we can hand it back. I think we have some exciting time for discussion in the breakout groups. So let me just see if there's any response from the panel before we hand back to the.
Can I come in here?
Yes, please.
Jean-Pierre Lombas, I'm saying that the process of designing the metrics is key. And for us, the process should start with the people impacted and not theoretically. And this is why we suggest to go to a case studies approach on concrete situation where people will identify what were the measurement that we were needing and that was not there, and what we can build as the way to collect information and to analyze them, to building indicators that can alert and allow comparison and allow predicability and measurement of impact of policies and strategies.
Thanks very much, Jean-Pierre. I think very helpful. Any other member of the panel? Otherwise, I would like to actually close this. But anyone else?
If I can come in just for a minute.
Yes, sure.
This is Aditya. So I think just very quickly, I think the main message is that we cannot think of adaptation in isolation to the enterprise of development. So what we should actually be measuring at the outcome and impact stage is well-being and development, because according to me, a community, an individual, a system is only truly resilient when well-being continues to increase despite shocks and stresses. So let's stay focused on the fact that adaptation has to serve the needs of development. Now, since I'm here representing the Adaptation Research Alliance, I'm going to just focus on the issue of process for 30 seconds and make a cheap plug for the 6 principles that guide our work at the Alliance, which I feel overlap with the 4 principles that we've heard today, but also extend those a little bit more. And in a couple of words, the principles are that research, or the development of metrics in this case, needs to be demand-driven. It needs to come out of a process of collaboration. It needs to demonstrate that it's going to have a societal impact. It needs to draw on robust evidence. And the process of research, and in this case, collating and collecting metrics, needs to empower people and build capacity. And also, finally, focus on vulnerabilities and inequalities that are structural to society. That's a shameless plug for our 6 principles that I feel can be quite useful in influencing the process of metric development.
Thanks, Aditya. Very, that's, I think, very appropriate. I do think that there is some strong synergy between these sets of principles, but and as well, we have to not forget the underlying purpose of why we are engaging in metrics development in the first place, which is that we want to focus on well-being and achieving development goals. I think that linkage is really quite critical. Any closing words from Andrea or Snigdha?
If I may, I just wanted to add another reflection to the layer of issues that have been mentioned. I think in the first place, in answering to the second piece of the question, is we really need to understand why we're trying to reach this balance between comparability, aggregation, and context specificity. You don't always have to do this. I mean, if you're looking in the context of the national M&E systems, then you need to strike this balance. If you're looking at the context of the global goal and adaptation, you also need to look at this, right? And I think that there is many valuable experiences that can be leveraged. For instance, the development of national M&E systems that have different methods of aggregation. And I think this is where AMI can come in and try to, as I said, synthesize a bit of these experiences and see how countries have been aggregating at different levels across sectors, across themes, across priorities, and so on. But before that, just really think about why you want to strike this balance, the context in which you're trying to achieve, because by aggregating, you may be losing the breadth and depth of adaptation actions and outcomes. it's much more difficult to aggregate across outcomes than it is to aggregate across outputs, like across numbers of beneficiaries reached and programs implemented and so on. And it's also very easy to lose track of those fine details of how your adaptation actions can actually lead to increased vulnerability or even like redistributing vulnerability.
Thanks, Andrea. Very, very important, and especially, I guess, if your emphasis is on learning, then preserving the contextual richness and detail becomes even more important. But any closing words from Snigdha before we hand back?
I'll add a very quick note on that. I think one thing that we do need to keep in mind is data, which is absolute key. Your metrics are only as good as your data is, and having that baseline data and mechanism to generate data and availability is absolute key to it.
Thanks, Snigdha. That's very good. Okay, so with that, I think let's wrap up the panel, and thank you all for some really good comments and rich discussions. I hope they will be helpful to IPAM, and turn back to, I think, Paul and Carl for the breakout groups.
Thank you very much, Alan. That's great. And thank you very much indeed to the panel for really, I've been making lots and lots of notes here. It's been really helpful indeed in what you've helped with. Now, I'm now going to turn to see if everybody else can help as well and have a bit of a contribution. We're going to have a quick breakout session. It's going to be slightly shorter than we had perhaps initially anticipated, but that's the way these things go. So what we're going to have, we're going to say 20 minutes and for the people to have the different breakout sessions. I'm going to hand over to Veer. Right, if everybody's back, Veer, can you confirm all the rooms are closed, please? Am I audible? Is everybody back from the rooms?
They're all back in main session.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope it was an interesting experience. It certainly has been on the technical front here. What I'm going to do is invite each of the leaders of the groups of the breakout rooms to summarize in a minute, for which I mean 2 minutes probably, just some of the sense of what was going on in the discussion or any particular points, but please keep it tight. We're going to overrun very slightly, but or past the hour, but hopefully we won't be too much longer. So can I invite Riyadh, would you like just to tell us how things went in the agriculture room, please?
Thank you, Paul. I would like to thank all the participants who joined the agriculture subcommittee discussion. So in very few words, all the attendees highlighted that there are hundreds of metrics dedicated to agriculture. And maybe we should start from that before designing new metrics. And there is a very interesting work done by FAO and ICRAF. They collected metrics according to the country perspective, what they identified in the framework of their climate strategies, NDCs and NARs, but mainly NDCs. And it could be a good starting point for gathering data, clarify the existing metrics, start harmonization, and maybe and later on we can also contact other international organizations, development organization, banks, vendors, and so on, to make the same exercise, so as to connect all the concerns in one, at least in one database, and then start screening what is relevant and what could be aggregated and simplified, but without losing information on the local perspective. Since Pedro Zorilla Miras highlighted that people are not in the same situation in front of climate change, and the metrics should capture the sensitivity of the poorest to climate change and their higher need in terms of adaptation. So aggregation, simplification, harmonization, yes, but without losing information, the crucial information concerning the poorest and the most vulnerable to climate change. And that's the main ideas, but we can share with you, Paul, further on more details if you like. Thank you so much.
That's what I'm going to ask all of the leaders of the sessions to do. Maybe we can do some additional note or a slide or two, which can be added to the main deck, which will be made available then for people subsequently. That's really helpful. Thank you for those points, Riyad. They're all very valid ones, and certainly not setting up new indicators when you've got quite a lot of other ones around the place is a very good point. It's the use of how we put them together, I think, is going to be key. I'm going to move swiftly on. Martha, would you like to report back on the cities, please? You may be muted. Yeah.
Sorry, I was saying that I was going to be quick. Okay, so here are my main three highlights, and I'm sorry if I couldn't cover everything because it was a very interesting discussion, and I think that we could have followed for a while. First, dynamics in cities should be considered, and also how cities are formed and which kind of cities we are taking into account. In this sense, for example, informality is important, and also future dynamics such as rapid urbanization. In this sense, this influences a lot of in terms of the availability of data, and also because mostly nowadays we rely in practice a lot of on formal data and formal sources of data. I'm sorry, I think there is an echo, Paul, if you can mute yourself.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, thank you. That's much better. The second one is related to the connectedness of cities, that we shouldn't ignore that, it was raised the point that we shouldn't fall in the trap of a scale, in the trap of a spatial scale. And also this has very much to do with the issue that we should take into account the localization of metrics, and this is crucial. The context specificity of metrics, especially when it comes to cities, and we were discussing that perhaps frameworks and principles could be common, but metrics themselves and the way we evaluate metrics should be contextualized. And finally, users. There is a huge variety of users when it comes to cities. I'm sure that in other areas as well. But it was mentioned potential conflicts and tensions when users are not involved in the processes of decision making and in development of metrics, and as it was raised by Andrea in the plenary, putting users at the forefront of the process could be a way forward. This is something that I'm adding right now, but this is something that I think is important. And I think that's all. And also it was mentioned the huge use of metrics being a tool for communication to different users and among users as well. That's all. Thank you for your participation in general to the city's participants.
Martha, thank you very much indeed for that. It sounds like it was an absolutely amazing conversation you were having in your group. There was so much information you managed to pull out there. That's really helpful, and we look forward to seeing a bit of maybe a summary of that we can pick up on later on too. Thank you very much for that. Driss, would you like to report on the water group, please?
Okay, thank you, Paul. In fact, we had a shorter
session because we ran into some logistic problems because I didn't have access to the share button, so I had to send my presentation. Anyhow, I talked about the water issues, especially on the sources of water themselves as conventional or unconventional water. Of course, the conventional waters are those who are natural, and the watershed is the main building block of such issues. And the unconventional water covers the wastewater and desalination systems. We mentioned the complexity of the water process involving multidisciplines like the others, uncertainties, because the data itself is stochastic, and the complexity related to climate change and information, socioeconomic and cultural aspect, spatial dimension, population growth, and multi-scale stakeholders and users, and the topic of water as a good and as a risk, availability, and also the risk. And for the discussion, we had already one discussant who mentioned that there are already a lot of data provided by the World Bank and some other international organization. This is true, but these are really rough indicators of water availability, disasters, and of course we need to work more on the adaptation issues and climate change practice. Well, this is it, I think.
Okay, just thank you very much indeed. That was a very useful summary there, I think, and I like the use of getting the mention of the stochastic processes in there as well, because that is a very key thing as well, and a lot of looking at metrics and modeling as well. Carl, would you like to wind up with the tools and techniques discussion, please? We can't hear you, Carl. Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Veer, is it possible to unmute Carl from our side?
I have sent a request.
I mean.
Okay, there we go. Thank you so much. I needed to find that button. I'm not going to say much except that we had a number of good interventions. One thing that was called out was engaging with the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, and I've been aware of their work but haven't really engaged with them, and I think that's useful. Also, there was discussion over how land degradation has followed a similar path to adaptation when it comes to this. There's a question over identifying residual risk of adaptation, so I think was very good. And also the question of adaptation needs and how it's a normative term, really. There was also a question over to what extent can we use a case study basis to build up our mapping of the tools and the techniques and how they can be deployed for different purposes. And then there were 3 comments related to questions over how the data doesn't necessarily match up with their utility for decision making, because it's siloed and it's maybe overly quantitative and it doesn't really translate to decisions. There's a question over inclusiveness, which has been raised before, and I think this is very critical. I might just note that inclusiveness issue when it comes to metrics also applies to the tools and the techniques, and I think that that's another thing we may want to take up. But clearly the question regarding gender inclusiveness and others, and how the results of metrics and perhaps our tools as well may be biased and not take into account these. And then a final thing had to do with the importance of stakeholder engagement. And I think this applies not just to metrics, but also the tools and techniques. So that was what we covered. I thought it was very useful, however short it was. And so thanks for all of those who contributed to that or participated in listening. I might just now, if it's okay, if I have the permission, just pass on to one final slide to give just sort of a a little understanding over some of the next steps for Amy, in case you're interested in working with us on this. We intend to develop a project design for both cross-sectoral and transversal metrics for tools and techniques as well in their application. Secondly, we want to follow up with the development of testing of adaptation modeling framework for aggregation. This is talking about after we do some mapping and evaluation. I think that this is important. And we want to also make sure, and we raised it in our introductory presentation, but that we roll out the AMI framework and how it can be useful to support everything up to the Conference of Parties 26 in Glasgow, if it happens in Glasgow, and onwards towards the global goal on adaptation work through to 2023. I think there's a critical gap that's been identified by the Adaptation Committee and others. How can we contribute? And I'd like for us to contribute through this framework. And then, of course, we want to be thinking about what to do after we've done some mapping and evaluation, how we can build on these outcomes. So this is the direction of travel we want to go, and we want to do it not, you can travel quickly if you go alone, but that's not really the way to do it if it's going to really result in something that will change the world. And we certainly have a lot of work to do and need all of your assistance in that. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to the Secretariat, to Swati, to close everything, but I just want to say thank you to all of you, participants, speakers, those who participated in the panel, and those who participated in the breakout session. This has been great, and we are going to try to take into account everything that was given. And so I don't know, Paul, if you want to say anything.
All I can say is thank you, Carla. Thank everybody indeed for participation, and particularly to Swati and Veer as well for pulling it all together and making the whole thing run. I apologize, we're a little bit over time, but I think it's been worth the extra few minutes. Thank you. Over to you, Swati.
Yes, I'd also like to say this is for all of IPAM too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Everyone on the steering committee and the committees.
Thank you. Thank you so much. On behalf of Adaptation Futures Secretariat, I would like to thank all our speakers for the rich and informative discussion that we've seen today. I would also like to thank our audience who've participated actively from around the globe. And last but certainly not the least, I would like to thank for our partners and our sponsors for their continued support and patronage, which is critical for the success of Adaptation Futures, given especially the unprecedented state of affairs. Just to reiterate, our recordings and the proceedings will be available on our website in due time. Do follow our websites and other social media for updates regarding the conference and webinars in future. Thank you all. Stay safe.